Hello, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. I'm Luca, and welcome to the first ever Amiable Arguments podcast. I'm very excited to be doing this, and I couldn't think of a better man to sort of be here and help me with the training wheels for this thing than a person that I know very well. It's my friend Harry, and now I'm going to tell you his address. No, 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 I'm not going to do that. So, Harry, thank you for being here with me today.
Absolute pleasure.
So we're going to just start diving into it with the heavy questions. Okay, so straight off the gate, what's your favorite color?
I think purple actually because it you don't see it as much.
Okay, fantastic. Right, thank you for being here. Right, that was great, everyone. That's a wrap.
Great, cool. Wrap up, cup of tea.
Okay, no, okay, so Harry, just why don't you tell us all a little bit about what you've wanted to talk about today and why you want to talk about it?
Sure. So, um, first of all, I just want to say I'm very excited by this whole format for a podcast, and I think it's ballsy stuff to have a podcast purely around issues of um, importance and things that are a taboo and go a bit unspoken. It's people aren't very forgiving of that kind of aspiration at the moment. So I really really appreciate this platform being put out there. So so just a bit of background myself. I'm nothing particularly special. I'm not a award-winning academic. I'm not a politician. I'm not even um, a revolutionary artist. I'm a graduate. I'm a graduate who is just basically stumbling about in the creative industry,
Hmm.
and I've had the immense good fortune to wind up working in a international theatre arts company. Um, half of our current members are British and half are mainland Chinese, and and I'm very grateful to be working in this company out of the blue. Um, and we make a lot of work that tries to scrape at universal ideas, philosophies that transcend cultural barriers, um, and that's sort of what I'm here to talk about today, because there's a there's a long-standing dichotomy that we're very used to using, which is to refer to tracks, basically the entire planet, as being separated between the West, the Western world, and then basically other,
Yes, yeah, I
whether it
was going to say other myself
because
because
it's
there are
it's
other
changed a few
parts that
times.
yeah, there are other parts that you wouldn't define as Eastern either. So therefore
Mm.
they have to fit into some sort of other category. So sorry, carry on.
Yeah, sure. It's there've been numerous roles in the other category over the years. There's been the Islamic Empire, the Dar al Islam. There's been the um, the the Soviet bloc. There's been the Orient, which is just a very strange and interesting word that just instantly just like summons aromas of spices and opium, which is it's a very
just to con-
very outdated.
just to confirm, the Orient includes Australia, right?
Well, I love how already you're sort of the cogs are spinning in the same way that it does for me, and you're already trying to see where you can chip away at this idea, and then um, and now I think in its current manifestation, it's sort of seen as the West versus a very interesting, divisive term. I think it has some merit to it, some drawbacks to it, which is the West and the global South.
Mm,
Which interesting how we ended up with a West and a South as the as the dichotomy of directions is
sure.
which rather tricky to wrap one's head around. But what's always interesting about these things is that the one side of the coin always is shifting, but then the other one has, at least as far as we talk about it, seems to remain consistent, which is the West. And I've been through studying at East 15 with the World Performance course. For those who aren't in the know, it's sort of like a anthropology meets theatre, I think is the best possible
Yeah.
way I can think about it.
I've actually heard
And
of the course. It's quite good.
for those not in the know, Luca and I were colleagues on said course. And I'm very pleased in those circles that such terms as the Orient or the East get rightly discredited, because it's just like, how on earth can you lump together Uzbekistan, Israel, and Thailand together just like that? What the hell are you talking about? Get out of my face. Um, but yet within the same breath have just the West, the West, the West, and it's something that I've just been mulling, umming, and ahhing over, just through writing essays and reading books and in my own artistic work, and also um, something I'm thinking about when I've been traveling. I've had the immense fortune to travel a great deal of the world. I've studied in Indonesia, in Russia, Japan, and I've also just had holidays to Costa Rica and Canada and Tanzania, and and sort of looking back on all of those travels, and ones moving forward, I just, this thinking of the idea of the West just really doesn't at all sit right with me, and now I feel, given this whole state of affairs that we're looking at now, where the entire question of globalization is thrown up in the air. The culture wars are reaching an absolute fever pitch. There's talks about the end of Pax Americana. Um,
Okay, sorry about that. Harry just had a knock at the door. So carry on with your point, Harry.
just as I was talking about the the dangers present, you start hearing a beating against the door. Um, but yeah, it just seems that um, this thing I've been umming and ahhing about, I just feel I need to talk about it more openly, because it's I feel it's something that can help, because I feel
Mm.
basically the crux of what I want to talk about today is we need to retire the term the West. We need to scupper it, give it a Viking funeral. It's outlived its purpose. We really need to move on.
And then I suppose really the logical question to follow that up from is: do we also therefore need to cremate and destroy the idea of the East as well? Is this or are we purely focusing on the West here?
Well, I think sort of by implication, yes, because sort of one of the things that I'm getting to the point of here is that
Sure.
one the existence of one demands the existence of the other. In fact,
Yes.
we don't use it so much as a term, but originally the Orient was always matched with the Occident. They they necessitate each other, I and in some ways the whole idea of the Orient bar the curious titling of SOAS, it is sort of a non-position, as it were. Like the people don't really think of the, unless it's just in in circles of extreme ignorance, most people don't really just look at the East Asia as one spicy blob.
Yes, yes,
they,
yes.
they they don't. People have the good sense to understand that um, there is a world of difference between the life experience of someone growing up in Jerusalem and someone growing up in Jakarta,
Yeah.
and that is rightly more and more respected. Um, but again, this and I will happily dissect the ideas of the Orient, or even just the idea of any monolithic continental culture, or any kind of cultural determinism, because I think that they're all equally incorrect. But the reason why I want to focus more so on the West is that this is the zombie argument that just doesn't quite die, and
Yeah.
all of the and I feel it's almost the last domino that needs to fall if we're to if this whole idea of trying to divide up the world can finally be put to rest.
Okay, so I assume based on that that the logical question really is what happens in your mind once this last domino, as you describe it, has fallen? What's the end game? What are we able to achieve on the other side of that we cannot already?
That's a very good question. That's a very fair question, and something I'm very conscious of in talking about this is I don't want to promote some kind of idea of an ultimate history, because the idea of any form of ultimate history, I think, is pretty dangerous in of itself, whether it's the rapture, or if it was the idea of the international dictatorship of the proletariat. It's just whatever we our idea of, just if we can just end this wretched cycle, then it will all be fine. It's naive. It's naive and utopian. Um, Having said that, um, I'm I'm not a small n nihilist. I do think we can do better, and I think in many ways my wish um, to retire Western is is very much to really try and truly embody what great ideals we ascribe to that term.
Right.
In fact, it's to say I want us to stop saying Western is not me saying I think liberal democracy has had it. I think capitalism has had it. It's
It's not you saying death to the West. It's not that. You know?
yeah. In fact, I was rather liking the idea of titling this thing "Death to the West, Long Live the West," because that is a little bit what what I'm about, in that I to give the broad stroke of it, the universal themes that the West aspires to, or at least the bits that we like about it, are supposedly universal.
Yes.
And the more we keep saying the West, the Anglosphere, um, the European realm, even though those I think are better because they're more specific, it is still putting a geographical location on the universal, which is
Sure.
a contradiction in terms.
Yes, it's very interesting because upon reading talking about Enlightenment values and the idea of
Mm.
liberal values, well, there's obviously John Locke is regarded probably as the father of liberalism, as it were. And his ideas of certain inalienable rights obviously led to those of Thomas Jefferson writing them down in the Declaration of Independence. But the idea that these rights are inalienable is not something that is well, it speaks to the whole of humanity, not just to what these rights don't just belong to one particular nation. The problem with that you have, of course, is that if you were to say, well, we want to then go on and give these rights, make sure that the citizens of the world have these rights, then that reeks of some level of cultural imperialism. Which I suppose perhaps I'm stretching a little bit here, but it's very, I think from that, it's never something we've entirely broken or gotten over, particularly even in the last decade. The idea that these rights are so important, and the standard, because now we don't think of them so much with the religious aspect of them anymore. We just call them human rights, and we're about the preservation of human rights. And obviously, over the past sort of 20 years, certainly during our lifetime, our country and many other countries in the, people can't see this, but I'm doing the quotation marks, Western world, have been, a lot of our campaigns in the Middle East have been, I don't want to go into the legitimacy of what they were actually based on or anything. That's an entirely different conversation. But it was laid out upon the standards of these people are being oppressed and their rights have been violated by brutal dictators. So we still do things on the platform of having the idea that these rights are universal. And I actually, what I do like about this view is there isn't really the way I see it of, there's no bigotry of low expectations, as I would call it. It's not a case of, well, actually, some people just aren't advanced enough to understand these rights. They're not, it just wouldn't work in their society. We've seen constantly things be tried and tested over, and I mean, how many different societies all around the world have gone through feudalism, or or socialism. I mean, or any of these, wherever they are, geographical location isn't very east-west, isn't very helpful in that dialogue.
No, it isn't at all, um, and I'd love to dive a bit further into the whole soft bigotry of low expectations, which is a wonderful maxim. I think it might have actually been first attributed to George Bush, but I know it best as being promoted by the very courageous and intellectually formidable activist Majid Nawaz, who, if listeners don't know, please look up Majid Nawaz's career, his journey. It is absolutely fascinating.
Very inspiring.
And I feel there is people downplay just how damaging and pernicious an idea that ideals such as freedom of thought, freedom of conscience, free. I would, to some extent, with an asterisk, put free trade in there as well. Certainly, free labor. That somehow there are just rigid cultural barriers that need to be protected, that stop people from fully engaging with that. It's sort of, and people don't really realize just the full extent of the maliciousness of where some of that can come from, because people look at it in a way of we'll taking the example of American Indians, in that it's a very, very common trope to be saying that American Indians have a much deeper understanding of the natural land, and um, and capitalism and pure like commercialism, materialism sullies their rich, beautiful spiritual tradition, and and on paper that seems on paper that seems fine. On paper that seems just we're looking at these cultural practices of a people, and and finding beauty and in them, but it doesn't take into account the way that affects policy. The fact that the United States has the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which is sometimes nicknamed by First Nation peoples as bossing Indians around. And this organization whole is responsible for the reservation system. Now, I don't want to get into the nitty gritty about whether the reservation system works, but an objection on the grounds of the reservation system is that their land is held is held in trust for them by the American government, meaning that they can't, if they want to do anything with their land, if they want to sell portions of their land, if they want to do any investments with their land, or even if they just want to keep their land just to do their own as they please, they they have to have all kinds of permissions from the American government. And that level of property, of holding property in trust for someone, is usually only reserved for children, prisoners, and people who are mentally or mentally incapable.
Yes.
Is that really the kind of message that people want to be telling them? And in fact, I would also strongly recommend to people just to see just how vicious this idea of of the Rousseauian noble savage, and how much it can really warp and retard a society, is if you look at the literature of the apartheid regime in South Africa. I'd say definitely the most grossly racist regime post the Second World War. Absolutely despicable. And the arguments that are posed by the apartheid regime to exclude um, uh, Africans from Black Africans from their rights as citizens is to protect them from the damning influence of European culture. Is to say that we would be losing this beautiful, inherently naive and ideal. It's absolutely repulsive. Not just in its kind of um, gross, whitewashed, sycophantic language, but also just the knowledge that underneath all these platitudes and ridiculous stories of asking the mountain for permission before they strike the first stroke with the pickaxe, there is this deep seething hatred and a wish to control and oppress them. And part of my thesis is that as long as we keep saying that the ideas of rationalism and the Enlightenment um, are tied to a Western culture, and there is an argument to be made on the side of the of very cynical postmodern types, on the side of native religious conservatives, and on the side of cutthroat capitalists, to say no, don't upset the balance, don't impose your Western thinking onto these people. They are quite happy. And I'm of the opinion, well, let's hear what their minorities think. Let's hear what what's their homosexuals, their women, their atheists, blasphemers, writers. What do they think? And I think we'd get a very different story.
Mm. I think it's quite interesting already that I can see that in having this conversation, we've already perhaps I shouldn't speak so much for yourself, but certainly from my point of view, it's already been a case of speaking like, well, inevitably, the whole idea of human rights and the whole idea of it's almost like the religious argument. It's like, oh, you happen to believe in the God uh, that is majoritively worshipped in the place that you were born. What a coinkydink. It's like, well,
Yeah,
it's like, oh, you're British and you happen to believe in liberalism and all these sorts of things. It's like, but why do those ideas have the right to win out on the world stage, as it were? And I suppose what I'd say to that is simply that I don't think they do. I think they simply win out um, on the merits of the arguments themselves. And if liberalism and the things that um, those countries that spawn that claim to fight for and defend, if they are defeated, and if there are better ideas or other ideas that are implemented around the world, then it's simply a matter of either one, a lack of belief in our own ideals, or, well, it's actually, sorry to go off on a little bit of a tangent, but this is quite an interesting thing that I was reading about recently that I
yeah,
think
sure.
I think ties into the whole East and Western discussion. Um, so it's very funny, sort of to tie this back to what you were saying at the start, that the whole concept of where the East is has moved about throughout history. Even as far back, I suppose, if we were to think of the genesis of Western civilization, most people would put their minds back to ancient Greece. That's where they go, and even as
Mm.
far back as ancient Greece, they would talk about the idea of the East, and the East at that time was, of course, the Persian Empire that had come about under Cyrus the Great, and then, of course, back then when the Roman Empire was the majority was the ultimate power in the West, they thought of the East as China, and they only had a few sort of emissaries and missionaries go over and do a little bit of trading, but on the whole, I think it took them about 10 years to get there. So you were basically with life expectancy those days. That really was a job for life, I suppose you could call it. But anyway, skipping forward. Oh, I don't know.
Well, actually, no, I'd like to quickly just go on that one because
Okay.
um, with the birth of the West there, that um, certainly it there is a kind of appeal. There is a partial appeal to the idea that from that I think the one thing that we could definitely put back to that time is it was the birth of so many great intellectual traditions, at least in as far as we measure in Europe, because in Indus Valley, Han China, whole different story. But um, but we rightly venerate the achievements of Socrates and Diogenes and Plato,
Maybe not Plato.
but maybe not so much Plato. Plato hasn't aged well.
That was a joke.
Um,
He's a genius, but he just draws some very strange conclusions.
yeah, um, but already that's a very short, very brief period in Greek history, limited to only one city, pretty much. I mean, you do have beautiful, we have beautiful poetry coming from Sappho of Lesbos, who absolutely fantastic, and you have some very witty one-liners coming out of Sparta, but the period we're talking about is a very brief period in the wider history of Athens, when most of Athenian history is being ruled as a as by various different military generals and kings. And furthermore, what's interesting is the whole idea of east west. Even then, there isn't a it isn't so much of a crystal idea as we might like to think, because Greece was only was around these times, are from the ancient to the classical, which is covering a large period. You Greece is only unified, uh, as far as I'm aware, three times before the Romans. In fact, I'd say two and a half times, which is one of them was just the Hellenic alliance against the Persians. The other being when the Spartans overran and took all of Greece, and then the other being when Alexander the Great.
With the
Now,
rise of Macedonia. But
hmm,
did he? Sorry, forgive. I'm obviously my history is a bit shaky. I thought he didn't really touch much of the mainland of Greece. I thought Alexander the Great was majoritively went into conquering the Persian Empire.
well, yeah, I mean, I'll have to defer to your information there, because I just haven't got it immediately on hand. But even then, more so the point that
Yes.
that at this point, far be it from Greeks seeing themselves as the West in antithesis to the East, they're not even seeing themselves as Greeks yet.
No.
They're still seeing themselves as cities. And furthermore, my I'm going to be referring to him a lot in this talk. Kwame Anthony Appiah, who is a professor of philosophy at the I want to say it's a New York university. I'm going to have to look it up in a second. I think it might be Columbia, but I feel like it doesn't matter. He's a fantastic um, philosopher, and he has written an excellent article on his thesis of why he feels Western civilization isn't really a thing. And he makes the very good point that, to Herodotus, he knew much more about Egypt and Persia, and had much greater affinity with these cultures than the Celts.
Mm.
The Celts they might as well have been Martians to these people. They had no idea what was going on well, they didn't, in most cases, a lot of them didn't know the British Isles even existed. So this idea of Europe, he put it very well, as that at this point Europe was only ever an adjective, never a noun.
Right. Okay.
Like with European. So already this I like to think of we're definitely going to be going into it further, but I sort of refer to this idea of the values from the values from an ideal Athens, passed on through Judeo-Christian values, through the Renaissance, through the Enlightenment. I sort of think of it as almost like a family heirloom kind of argument.
Well, it
That there
almost
is.
is. It's like a meta narrative.
Mm,
It's a meta narrative, and I'm not someone to want to throw away meta narratives lightly, because I think everyone has them. Everyone has the right to have them, and they can instill an individual or a nation or a continent. Indeed, you see this whether you're in favour of Cornish independence or British independence or a European Union. You have ideas about what your society is, what it used to be, and why what you're doing now is a natural progression for it. Now, in some of those cases, obviously, we don't always get it right, and sometimes I don't think it's fair to say that we read the narratives wrongly, because that implies that I have some sort of monopoly on truth, which
mm,
I
mm,
definitely don't. But obviously, sometimes it can be very, very dangerous, and we can do things incredibly nationalistic because of these things, such as in the case of fascist regimes of the early 20th century. The idea that, well, I mean, is there the whole meta narrative of there being an Aryan race all those hundreds and hundreds of years ago, and the need to reunite them within one nation, almost like it's like a socialism of race, a nationalizing of a race. It's a it's quite a strange idea. But sorry, if I could just bring it.
I just please no one just take that one quote in isolation. Nationals, no socialism. Oh, that's a strange idea.
What? Sorry, I'm a bit confused. Has it been tried before? The no. Actually, it's funny. I don't. I feel like I've jumped the gun a bit because all of a sudden we've gone from ancient Greece to Nazi Germany, and I'm really sorry for those listening that I've done that. It wasn't.
I mean, to be fair, with the Spartans, fascist Italy kind of did the same thing.
Yeah,
so.
yeah, totally. It all comes from the Spartans. But no, I think it's fair that I've done that purely on the basis of talking about meta narratives and the connecting of something far from the past to far in the future. But I was actually wanting to just quickly swing this by you, which was the idea that, as I was saying, that oftentimes the idea is that Greek civilization is like the Western frontier, and you could even bring that. You could say it pushed forward a little bit with the Eastern Roman Empire, and that Constantinople became the gateway between East and West. And I think that was sort of even more put into people's minds back in the day by the fact that if you stood in the, by I've forgotten the name of the river, but is it the Galata? In Constantinople, if you were to stand in the middle of it, you were to look on one side and you would see Europe, and you would look on the other side and you would see Asia. And they called it the crossroads of the world, which, apart from being the most epic name ever, is just, it's very interesting. But then, of course, the idea that the West pushes forward, and at this point, I suppose by West, at this time period we're just talking about the forces of Christendom. It's very funny. So then, obviously, when the fall of Constantinople came from the Ottomans in 1453, and then they took Constantinople, there are some historians who basically described that event as the start of modern history, as we know it. But then, sorry, because I'm rambling a little bit on this. The point that I wanted to get to was that by the time, so the West is able to almost like a sweeping blanket push forward across into Asia and into the East. And then it's a very interesting idea. I was reading a book a few weeks ago by the Austrian free market economist Friedrich Hayek, who was writing a book called The Road to Serfdom. And he wrote this book in 1944 when he was a professor at one of the prestigious British universities. I can't quite remember which one right now. And he basically he outlined in his book not so much his opinion, but the general consensus of the time was that Nazi Germany was now, and everything east of that was part of the East. That the Soviet Union was part of the East. That Maoist China was part of the East. That Nazi Germany, which Hayek, from his point of view, perceived as a very socialist nation spawned by not Marxist socialists, but a form of socialism, and he believed that to be Eastern, which I find to be, I have a bit of a dispute with, because these aren't Eastern ideas. These aren't ideas, socialism, Nazism. These aren't ideas to come out of the geographical East, as it were. These are ideas to come out of, as we would characterize it, the West. So it's almost as if we've gone, they've adopted these, these communist nations have spread up, and we've gone, oh, damn Eastern, and Germany and France and all these countries are just over there sweating bullets like, oh no, they're gonna, realise that we came up with those sorts of things. I mean, even going back to ancient Greece, it was Epicurus, that the idea that of the Epicurean commune, that people would just live without familial ties and without desire for material wealth. They would just live on these communes in each other's company, enjoying each other's company, with no real obligation to wider society. A lot of these things are ideas to come out of the West, and yet by the time we get to the mid 1900s, they were being perceived as Eastern ideas, which I find very fascinating.
Well, I mean, to sort of find almost a synthesis for everything that I'm going to say, and I know it's rather fairly early on in this whole thing to already have it, but it just matches brilliantly. Is part of what I'm advocating is against this kind of cultural deterministic idea that the sum of one civilization, in this case rather ill-defined, has a fixed destiny by virtue of the things that have come before, that they are going to have this, and this will be their contribution, rather than what I think is a much it's more pragmatic, but it's also, I think, backed up by more evidence to look at the entire sum of human history and look at phenomena, look at things that emerge at times in places due to, in part, I will concede, part due to the culture of a region, but also down to a whole host of factors that the people often don't get into. I'd love to go on to that point, but I feel it's important to, I think, round off this whole thing of just looking at what is the West as presented to us. And you rightly, you say the retroactive idea that we have of it, it's not the idea they had at the time, is that it begins in Greece. It begins with these Aristotelian ideals, the Socratic method, the beginnings of theatre, the beginnings of the natural sciences and natural philosophies. Then this family heirloom somehow gets passed along through Christendom. I think you could make a much better argument of Christendom as being an actual phenomenon, because there is something that you can measure in that. There is something that it is almost like a quasi empire, a quasi civilization, not quite the level of Rome, because Rome does have an administrative center. It does have a consistent legal framework. It has infrastructure. It has a system of languages, a system of commerce that is fairly universal enough to mark it as a single polity.
Sure.
If you try, you can make an argument that Christendom does resemble some form of civilization. That you have the language of Latin, you have an overarching institution in the form of the Catholic Church. You have a similar, meta narrative that binds the people together, is a rough idea of how the world should be. And if those things are all it takes to measure a civilization, then yes, it is a civilization. But then the following argument that would be made by a lot of conservative traditionalist types is that the success of the West is down to the Judeo-Christian idea that the individual is sovereign, combined with an idea that the ecclesiastical order provides a framework, a legal framework that gets to an idea of universal law. And this was something that was expressed by Francis Fukuyama in one of his books, that once you put this legal idea of there are laws that are above terrestrial authority, that you already start the ball rolling for for the democratic progress.
Right.
Um,
I mean,
so
even. Oh, sorry. Do continue.
yeah. Just to round off that point, that it's it's not an idea wholly without merit, and it has. I mean, it's in the past it has proved a useful idea, but it's again just one of those things where it with the full weight of what we know now, it's an idea that is coming apart at the seams, and it's not really in our international globalist long-term interest to try and keep that idea on life support. And so that yeah, you wanted to respond.
Oh well, it might feel like a bit of a backtrack, but just going off of your point about the idea of there being some sort of um, I'm trying to remember how you phrased it because it was great, but the idea of a higher law that we
Hmm.
can't appeal to, and we can't judge it. We can only sort of submit to it, as it were. And the idea that obviously going back to 1215, Runnymede with the Magna Carta, that King John was God's anointed on earth, and because of that, he could behave in many ways almost like God. He didn't have to actually have. There was no one to judge him but God, and I suppose to some extent the Pope. But John's relationship with the Pope was a bit rocky at best.
Hmm.
So but obviously the idea of the Magna Carta is that no, actually you are also underneath these laws. These laws do um, well, you have to submit to them as we mere mortals do, you know. And then ever since then, it's just sort of been certainly with our parliament system, it's been since it sort of sprung out of the 1300s that it's all been one long journey, slowly relinquishing rights away from the king and what they can do and can't do, all the way up to the Civil War, and then obviously passing it further with the 1688 Bill of Rights, um, and then further through, obviously, with the Enlightenment values.
Hmm. Yeah, and that's where the West idea continues, this family heirloom idea
Mm,
that on this silver plate, the Greeks made their mark, and then the Christendom, Judeo-Christian values polished it, gave it a better hue. Someone left it aside for a little bit, but then the Renaissance humanists just found it, dusted it off, made it sparkly again, and then the Enlightenment, and then we really started getting on board, and we started making etches and
mm,
engravings and all these things, until finally in our contemporary, progressive, post Cold War age, we are it's become a treasure of limitless value, and we have to be and we have to pay the utmost, almost Confucian level of respect to our unbroken
mm.
lineage of ancestors who gave us this treasure. Um, so is it's hard finding a an academic and liberal language for
Excuse me.
bollocks, because
Right,
because
editing that
because
part out.
because there are because it has the structures of a myth about it. It's Arthurian or biblical, an idea of a prophecy, a promised land, that there is something continuously going, when the actual reality is much messier, and
Oh, entirely.
and in fact, and crucially, is not without external influence. And this is again, just a crucial point, that there is no culture in the world. Maybe I think the only culture you might be able to make an argument that lives in isolation is the people of the Sentinel Islands. People who have been so isolated that they don't even have metalwork. We have no idea how their language works, because every single time anybody tries to get to the Sentinel Islands, they are killed by these people.
Oof.
You could make an argument for them. You could make an argument for them, but every other human society on the planet has been influenced in some way by their neighbors, and this is the case with the with again, why I feel this idea of this unbroken, almost completely of its own bootstraps West is just does not hold up to scrutiny. I mean, leaving aside the fact that the religion that takes hold of the continent for most of its history has its origins in Palestine, just leaving that aside for Western European, the treasures of ancient Greece weren't lovingly preserved by Christendom. In fact, it's very telling that when considered by many people to be probably the greatest scholastic achievement of, at least on a macro scale, the greatest scholastic achievement of Hellenistic society, the Great Library of Alexandria.
Yes.
The remains of which, because it tragically was burnt down during a Roman invasion, but the remains of it in the form of the Serapeum were callously destroyed by early Christian mobs. They definitely did not want this golden nugget of ancient Greece to survive. They actively suppressed it, and then on the years that people would, the church would keep some level of Aristotelian metaphysics still alive. Again, this is for a tiny percentage of the population who are actually involved with this, and so when the idea of the so-called birth of humanism in the Renaissance happens, first of all, again, this is, if to the vast majority of the population of Europe at this time, nothing would have changed. Just your barren overlord has another book and a nicer painting. That would be the extent of the change for a great many people. But yes, for these select few artists and artisans and scientists, early emerging scientists, proto-scientists, they are getting this sudden revival, renaissance of these classical values. But where do they come from? Because they don't come from the church.
No, it's very interesting because in a way the church, the grip that it had on freedom of thought, experimentation, on arts and literature and all these sorts of things, just a mass censorship. Ironically, Plato would have loved it. It's very.
We're going to be slating Plato.
I'm sorry, I promise. Every single podcast from now on, I will find some window to dunk on Plato. It's going to be great. It was just that I was reading The Republic, and just to tie into what Harry was saying, the idea that at the end of it, he sort of said, if there'd be one thing I'd be most proud of in creating my utopia, which is basically just a rigid caste system where people are fed through education the idea that they're made of either gold or silver or iron, and that is inherently their worth in society, and that only those gold tier subscribers, the philosophers, actually get any sort of reward or decision out of this. But he said that the thing I'm most proud of is the censorship of the arts. And I remember reading this and just thinking, right, Plato, I feel personally attacked. It was like, but this is the thing, and you see this with Sparta actually, which Plato was totally admirable of. That when you have that level of authoritarianism and resistance of change, and you could even liken this, I imagine, in many ways to the Tokugawa clan and the isolationism of Japan, that just an absolute no to any sort of outside influence. That you want to do things completely your way without any sort of influence from anyone else. It makes it very rigid, and it does. If you want it, it works. It will keep things very similar for a very long period of time. But unfortunately, the world, eventually something will come along and change it. That something in this case being Matthew Perry. But it's you can't you can
that is the case of changing Japan, not changing Christendom. His ships were very impressive, but as far as I know, they didn't time travel.
I mean, maybe that's a script you could work on.
That will, if I'm working on it, if I'm ever writing a script where Matthew Perry uses his ships to start the Renaissance, then that will be when basically you'll need to remove sharp objects from my vicinity.
Right. Okay. You heard it here first, folks. Okay.
Yeah, I'm willing to go on record.
We've got about 5 minutes left that I can afford you, just because I'm using my friend's laptop right now. So,
right.
Is there anything sort of in this? I'd just like to give you the time to give some final thoughts.
Hardly got final thoughts already. Hardly got our trousers off yet.
Well, maybe. Well, we could always come back and do a part 2, Electric Boogaloo. Not today, but obviously.
Yeah. Could we then? Because I've sort of only really gotten into the whole. I've touched on why the West is I feel a bit of is an outdated idea, but only really we're just sort of getting stuck into the how it emerges and what are the things that give it its so-called legitimacy. So, all right then. Well then, we're in the spirit of trying to do a part 2. Then I think I'm going to try my best to summarize the broad strokes of what the West is, what it has been, and outline where we will go on and talking about why it should be dismantled, why it doesn't hold water, and so forth.
Which we'll get into after in the next part, after everyone listening has liked and subscribed.
You tool.
Absolutely. I had it coming.
Yeah. Ruthless capitalism being a Western.
Hey, I didn't do this for the money. There is no profit incentive.
No, you genuinely do not do it. This is a passion project, and it is for me too. But so then from the family heirloom then goes on to past the beginning stirrings with the Renaissance, which, as I was saying, did not come from within the church. They came principally from trade and dialogue with the comparatively more liberal Umayyad and Abbasid caliphates, which, while by today's standards would not be places you'd want to live in, by medieval standards were the most liberal, open, tolerant societies, perhaps in the world at that time. And it certainly says a lot about, when you compare it to now, that at the time of the Abbasid Caliphate, when the capital was in Baghdad, there was a house of wisdom in which they were already already pioneering an idea of plurality of thought, much more advanced than comparatively what was happening in Europe at the time, where Hindus, Muslims, Christians of different sects, Muslims of different sects would meet and discuss and debate uh, religion, ethics, philosophy, natural sciences, um, and for me, that's a small reminder of the fact that no one society is ever one way forever. These things all have ebbs and flows. But then moving on to the I think what I will, I suppose, round off this section with is to talk about, to quickly, as quick as I can, touch on the idea of the Enlightenment and how it relates to the idea of the dominance of the West. And because one of the arguments in favor of in favor of a Western political as well as cultural hegemony is the idea, well, not only do these capital W Western values suit the societies for their just on a domestic level, but they also give them the power to influence and subjugate most of the rest of the world. And the argument being, well, because of the heirloom, we have the individual as sovereign. That the idea that purely through, I guess, tyranny of will, just what European scientists were just able to blitz through scientific revolutions far quicker than could be achieved by Chinese or Muslim scholars, and that gave the technological might in which to form a new a new occidental hegemony across the world.
Sure.
And the and leaving aside all of the struggles that they had to go against the largest Western institution being Catholic and Protestant churches in order to achieve this, it leads aside a very, very important parts in the study of history and the study of geopolitics, which is the study of sheer dumb luck. And because there are factors that lead to Europe's ascendance that aren't paid attention to as much, and just to try and get to one quite boring but very important one, and then one freaky out of left field one.
Okay, we'll have to make this the final point, Harry.
I'll have to I'll have to try and speed this up as quick as I can.
Right, you've got 1 minute. Go. No, I'm joking.
Food surplus. You there. If we're looking at much of the reason why a great civilization emerges in Africa in the Nile and doesn't in the Congo is because it is much, much easier to make a food surplus with predictable flooding in the Nile than it is in the very, very harsh conditions of the Congo. It is not down to Egyptian people just being inherently somehow more enlightened. If you can't get a food surplus going, the game of civilization is very, very difficult.
It wasn't meant for you.
It wasn't meant. It wasn't meant to be. Europe had a very, very good advantage in that, in terms of our climate, in terms of access to cold and warm water ports, freedom of certain diseases and natural disasters. Without all of those immense obstacles in the way, you can go a lot further. And then the other one, which is I love this example, the freaky example, because this shows not just physical geography, but the wonderful chaotic way that the human story works. Is if you compare the reason why Europe was able to, broadly speaking, Europe was able to technologically surpass China, even though China was for a long, long time leaps and bounds ahead of Europe, which was porcelain, which was just purely by the fact that China had porcelain. They and were very satisfied with it. There was so much less of an emphasis on glass production. But in Europe, where we didn't have porcelain and did have more fervent glass production, from wine glasses, you then start getting lenses, telescopes, astronomy, microscopes, biology, spectacles, giving scholars and scientists 10 to 15 years more work and research than they would to other counterparts. Chemistry, because you have non-reactive things. Just by the freakiest accident of Chinese civilization going, well, these porcelain cups work so well. Why should we fart around with this difficult to work with glass? Would eventually lead to Europe's success in the Opium War. Who could have foreseen that?
It's incredible. That is an amazing halfway point to sort of end on, actually, because I need to pass the laptop over to my friend now. So, Harry, thank you so much for being here today. I hope you come back very soon to do part 2.
Absolutely. Like I said, haven't got our trousers off yet.
Yeah, well, steady on. You should see him. He's like a little kid on the other end of this chat. But anyway, thank you so much, everyone, for tuning into the first ever podcast. I'm very excited to hear your thoughts. Whether you agree or disagree, that's all part of the process, and I can't wait to hear what everyone has to say and to hear your input into what's going on. And just lastly, I'd like to give a huge shout out to my friend Irina for supplying me with the fantastic artwork that you will see draped across the podcast's screen. And I will leave a description. I will leave a link in the description, even, which will give you a link to more of her artwork. And if you could go support her, that would be very much appreciated on both our parts. So thank you for your time. Harry, thank you for being with me.
Thank you for having me. See you next time.